Late one night a few years ago, police received a frantic emergency call from a 15-year-old girl. We'll call her Elle. Elle told police that a 26-year-old man, whom she called her pimp, had gotten mad at her because she had not gotten the money up front from the latest man he had forced her to have sex with. While driving her around, perhaps to her next so-called date, the pimp, a 300-pound man, punched Elle in the face so hard that she feared for her life. She jumped from his moving car and ran until she felt safe enough to call the police. Police found Elle wearing nothing but underwear and a tank top. Police later learned that the pimp had been posting online classified ads for Elle ever since she had run away from home a few weeks earlier. Man after man would log on and order Elle for home delivery as if she were a pizza. Elle was a victim of sex trafficking. But Elle was not from some rural village in Cambodia or Thailand. No, Elle was from right here in Tucson, Arizona. She was sold for sex in the Santan Valley just southeast of Phoenix. And she's not alone. This month alone, Tucson police have found at least 3 other minors in prostitution right here in town. Sex trafficking is happening right in our own backyards. My name is Andy Hall, and tonight I'm here to tell you that prostitution is not a victimless crime. I'm the co-founder of Southern Arizona Against Slavery, a local anti-trafficking nonprofit. I'm also a law student at the U of A, where I'm studying to represent trafficking survivors one day. And tonight, I want to talk about 3 things. First, I want to ask, what is human trafficking? Second, I want to debunk some common myths about prostitution and set the record straight. And third, I want to ask, what can we do about it? So first, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is the 2nd largest international crime and the fastest growing. A new estimate released just today puts the annual profits from human trafficking at over $150 billion. That's like 3 apples put together. Between the 2 types of human trafficking, there are between 21.9 million and 29.8 million people who are victims of trafficking today. Experts agree that human trafficking amounts to modern-day slavery. There are 2 types of human trafficking, as I said. First, there's labor trafficking, which is just what it sounds like, people being forced to do labor in various industries, from agriculture to sweatshops. Second, there's sex trafficking. Sex trafficking most commonly takes the form of forced or coerced prostitution. The legal definition of sex trafficking under federal law is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or when the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. That's kind of jargony, but here's the gist of it. Any prostitution that's induced by force, threats, violence, coercion, psychological manipulation, brainwashing, or any prostitution of any minor is automatically considered sex trafficking under federal law. It's also important to distinguish between human smuggling and human trafficking. Human smuggling is a voluntary illegal crossing of a border, illegal immigration. Human trafficking, in contrast, refers to slavery, which is by definition involuntary and is a crime against a person, not a border. Let's not conflate those 2. Okay, so a little quiz. Which of the following people is a victim of sex trafficking under federal law? A homeless 16-year-old boy who trades sex for food. B, a 21-year-old woman who walks the streets so that her boyfriend won't beat her again. C, a 35-year-old woman who has sex with men for money so that her pimp/drug supplier will give her daily dose of heroin. D, a 17-year-old girl in prostitution with no pimp. Or E, all of the above. Yes, you've all taken the SAT. You know to pick all of the above when it's an option. All of these people are victims of sex trafficking under the law. B is a victim of sex trafficking because her prostitution is induced by violence. C is a victim of sex trafficking because her prostitution is induced by coercion, specifically the pimp's coercive manipulation of her drug addiction. And A and D are minors in prostitution, therefore automatically victims of sex trafficking, period. Even though D doesn't have a trafficker, she's still a victim of trafficking. It's important to note, A and D are not child prostitutes, okay? There's no such thing as a child prostitute. There is only a prostituted child. So all these people are victims of sex trafficking under the law, and that's true whether or not they would self-identify that way. It's true of that 35-year-old even if she tells you that she's doing it voluntarily. The bottom line is sex trafficking is happening all around us. Okay, now I want to turn to debunking some myths. First of all, this idea of a prostitute as a high-class, call girl, sexually empowered, pretty woman entrepreneur is largely a fiction that's been cooked up in women's studies classes. I'm not saying it's impossible to voluntarily choose prostitution, but what I am saying is that the majority of people in prostitution today are victims of sex trafficking. We can set aside the academic debate about what the policy should be with respect to consenting adults, because the reality is the majority of people in prostitution are not consenting or not adult. My friend Beth, a survivor of sex trafficking here in Tucson, conducted a survey of 120 people in prostitution. She found that of those 120, 119 met the legal definition of sex trafficking victim. That's over 99% of her sample. And get this, the average age of entry into prostitution in Arizona is between 14 and 15 years old. Yeah, now we can really see pretty woman disappearing into the distance. 14 to 15 years old? That seriously weakens the argument that even many adults are in prostitution voluntarily. Because if she was sexually abused by her stepdad at age 12, turned out on the street at age 15, and now, once she's 18 or 19, says she's doing it voluntarily, but is really continuing to act out this pattern of sexual violence that for her has become normalized, we're right to inquire just how voluntary her self-described choice really is. And if we saw prostitution for what it really is, we would understand why so few people do choose it of their own free will. So let's do another quiz. True or false? Most prostitution involves women walking the streets and flagging down cars. That's false. Yeah, most prostitution today actually occurs online. It's set up through online sex ads, like in Elle's case. How about this? Most Johns, or buyers of sex, are lonely guys who just can't get laid otherwise. False. You're getting the idea. Actually, the majority of Johns are married, and most of them have kids. How about this one? Most prostitution occurs on a Friday or Saturday night. False. In fact, prostituted people will tell you one of their peak times for business is Monday through Friday at the lunch hour. Now, why is that? Well, because all those married Johns have the alibi of being at work then. One more. Prostitution is typically an easy, high-paying, and glamorous job. That is false in all caps. Prostitution is typically violent, dangerous, and degrading work. Here's just how dangerous prostitution really is. From the day someone begins prostituting, their average life expectancy is about 7 years. Here are the results of a survey of American women in prostitution. The findings are startling. 86% of American women in prostitution report physical assault by both their Johns and their pimp. 80% report sexual assault by their John. 70% report sexual assault by their pimp. 61% report having weapons used against them. 34% said that they or their family had been threatened with death. 88% report psychological abuse. 65% said they'd been blackmailed with pornography made of them. And on the list goes. Fully 100% of women interviewed in this survey said that they knew another prostituted person who had been a victim both of sexual assault and physical violence. The evidence is abundantly clear. Prostitution is not a victimless crime. No. Prostituted people are victims. At worst, they're victims of violent, coercive sex trafficking. But at best, they're victims of a sexist society that condones commercialized, gender-based violence. You see, prostitution is not about sex. Most Johns could easily get sex elsewhere, from their wives or girlfriends, or just by picking someone up at the bar or whatever. Johns aren't paying for sex per se. What they're really paying for is the opportunity to exert total power and control over someone. They're paying for the opportunity to sexually and physically assault someone. They're paying for the opportunity to act out their most violent, degrading, and dehumanizing fantasies. Prostitution is not about sex. It is about power. So, what can we do about it? Well, Some well-meaning people, maybe some of you, have suggested legalizing and regulating prostitution. If prostitution were legal, they argue, prostitutes could demand better working conditions. They could unionize. They could demand on condom use. They could get routine STD testing, and so on the argument goes. Now, if I told you that I don't think legalizing prostitution is the right approach, someone might think, oh, well, he's a prude. Someone might think, well, he must not be sex positive. Maybe somebody says, oh, he's just a religious moral crusader. But really, all of those are ad hominem attacks or red herrings, and what I want to focus on is the facts and the data. I argue that legalizing prostitution is not the right approach because empirically it has failed where it has been tried. Take the Netherlands, for instance. The Netherlands legalized prostitution in 2000. It wasn't long before buyers of sex the world over realized that Amsterdam was a place where they could go buy sex with impunity. So economic demand for prostitution shot up. But the supply of voluntary prostitutes only increased a little bit. So what happened? Sex trafficking. That's what. Criminal gangs moved in and they increased the volume of trafficking to make up for that shortfall in demand. An NGO in Amsterdam called Child Right estimated that in 1996, before the legalization, there was about 4,000 children in prostitution in the Netherlands. By 2001, just 1 year after the legalization, that had increased by over 300% to about 15,000 children in prostitution. In 2008, the Dutch National Police, reporting their findings about the legalization, said, quote, "The idea that a clean, normal business sector has emerged is an illusion," unquote. Job Cohen, the former mayor of Amsterdam, echoed this when he said, quote, "We've realized that this is no longer about small-scale entrepreneurs, but that big crime organizations are involved here in trafficking women and other criminal activities." And a recent London School of Economics study confirms this effect, that in countries with legal prostitution, there's actually more coercive sex trafficking, not less. And the same thing happened in Germany. Germany legalized prostitution in 2002, and over the next 5 years, sex trafficking there increased by 70%. Just last year, the German newspaper Der Spiegel published a withering expose about prostitution in post-legalization Germany. And their findings are startling as well. 200,000 people in prostitution in Germany. Of those, 65 to 80% are from foreign countries like Bulgaria and Romania. Okay, that alone should be a big red flag because these immigrants' desperation for a better life makes them that much more vulnerable to the coercive trickery of sex trafficking. Time magazine recently dubbed Germany the cut-rate prostitution capital of the world. And even though prostitution is legal in Germany, 59% of prostituted people say they don't feel that's made them any safer from sexual and physical assault. And many people still choose to engage in prostitution outside of the legalized and regulated framework because they don't want to register with the government, preferring to remain anonymous instead. Legalization might look good on paper, but in practice, it actually backfires. Recognizing this, some European countries have started to take a different approach. Here's what Sweden does. It's going to sound crazy, but it's just crazy enough to work. In Sweden, the sale of sex is legal, but the purchase of sex is illegal. The sale of sex is legal, but the purchase of sex is illegal. You see, Swedish lawmakers realized that prostitution is about power, not sex, and so they sought to put some power back into the hands of those selling sex. There's no way she's going to be the one walking out of that room in handcuffs because selling sex is legal. Rather, this approach targets the demand for prostitution, the Johns, without whom prostitution and sex trafficking would not prosper or not even exist. This directly contradicts the prevalent boys will be boys mentality that normalizes gender-based violence, and it rightly apportions the blame to the Johns. And the Swedish model works. After Sweden implemented this law, sex trafficking fell by 2/3. Other countries have followed suit now. Norway, Iceland, and France have copied them, and Belgium and Iceland are considering doing the same. Ironically, even in the Netherlands, legislators are now inching toward the Swedish model after their own experiment with legalization has backfired in practice. In February 2014, the European Parliament adopted the Swedish model as an EU-wide policy, which encourages member states to revisit their own prostitution policies. Prostitution is not a victimless crime. Prostituted people are victims, victims of trafficking, or at least victims of sexism and violence. The Swedish model, which makes the sale of sex legal but the purchase illegal, is the only approach that is actually shown in practice to reduce the amount of coercive sex trafficking that occurs. I urge you to ask your legislators here in the US and in Arizona to adopt the Swedish model. Because if we can prevent the sex trafficking of even one child like Elle, it will all be worth it. Thank you.